What were the differences in the management of information operations between MACV and the People's Army of Vietnam? We look at IO operations with Sir Max Hastings.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 62 of the Principles of War podcast. This is part 2 of our interview with Sir Max Hastings, the author of Vietnam, An Epic Tragedy, 1945 to 1975. Let's get straight into the discussion with Sir Max. Institutionally, the United States appears to have failed to heed the warnings from the troops on the ground about the best way to improve the situation. So men like John Paul Vann and David Hackworth. What do you think caused their reluctance to listen to the lessons learned and instead look at metrics like body count as measures of success?
Well, it's a big problem. There was a British officer in the late 19th century who wrote a book about how to deal with counterinsurgencies. He published this about 1896. Many of the problems he identified then are problems that still prevail. And he said, it is really difficult, if you don't have an enemy capital to capture, to decide how you measure success when you're fighting. They didn't use words like counterinsurgency in 1896, but that sort of idea. So they had to find some measure in Vietnam for success or failure, and they chose this grotesque body count. To be fair, in all wars, in the Second World War too, everybody would talk about how many Japanese or how many Germans had been killed or wounded or captured. And that is a sort of vaguely standard. But here it became an obsession that Carmelantes, who wrote the superb novel Matterhorn, he wrote somewhere, and I was quoting it somewhere the other day. He was a young Marine officer in Vietnam, and he said, we all know that everybody lies some of the time in civilian life. You lie in your marriage, you lie in your profession, you lie in whatever. And soldiers lie too. But he said what was different in Vietnam was that lying became institutionalized. He said, you get some lance corporal, and this is an example he gave, out in the boonies who gets in a firefight, he loses 2 or 3 people killed. He's suddenly bombarded with radio questions from every level, from people who are miles away. They want to know what came out of this action. That he's got 3 KIA in his hands. He's got 1 or 2 of his best friends who've got body part missing and so on. And this lance corporal is being asked, what have we got to show for this? And so in Carmelantes' terms, and Carmelantes said, I as a Marine officer was party to this. He said, we lie. Because these people 25 kilometers away, they are not going to know whether you're telling the truth or not. But they desperately want something to show for it. In fact, he cited the comparison with Leonidas' 300 and the pass of Thermopylae in whatever it was, 400 BC. And he said, how would it have been if somebody had turned up in Sparta and said, well, actually, we've lost our 300, but how many dead Persians have we got to show for it? And there's a sort of madness about this, but this is what the Americans got into. And Carmelantes described vividly, these guys on the ground just made up a number. They were doing this all the time. I have been in a South Vietnamese Sky Raider circling on station, and you circle as long as you've got fuel with bombs and cannon. And the Bird Dog spotter aircraft, which was being flown by an American, he said he was flying around looking for targets for them. But then finally, my pilot, we had a wingman too, he says, he's only got 5 more minutes fuel, use me or lose me. The Bird Dog says, right, bomb on my smoke. And I was in the goddamn cockpit when we bombed some wretched village that, to this day, I have no idea whether there's any bad guys in it. But I'm quite sure that they go back and they report that they've killed X number of bad guys in this village because to justify the expenditure of the ordnance. So I come back to something I think is terribly important about all military things. 1976, I wrote a book about the Israeli army, and I visited their commando school. One of their instructors who was showing me around, he said, you know what we mark most highly for? He said, telling the truth. He said, we've come to the conclusion that so many screw-ups on the battlefield happen because people who are supposed to be at point A but are actually hopelessly lost will report over the radio that they've reached the objective, or they'll report over the radio that they've taken this and they've taken that and so on. And this guy was showing me around. He said, we teach these people, we will forgive you anything if you accurately report over the radio your true position. I said in my book on Vietnam, I said the biggest mistake that the Americans made was not to lie to the world, not to lie to the American people. It was to lie to themselves about what was going on. And I think, although it's a very simple principle, telling the truth is not merely a virtue. I think if you want to wage a successful war, you've got to tell the truth to each other.
Absolutely. So the next question, there are stark contrasts between the way that the US and North Vietnamese handled the media. What lessons are there for military operations about handling the information that comes out through the media?
Well, the lesson from Vietnam is a sad one, and that is, in one respect, the Americans behaved incredibly honorably in Vietnam. That although they lied through their teeth in their briefings, many of which I've attended, they would always, if you said, I don't believe you, I want to go and see, you could always get out there. They would give you space on a fixed-wing aircraft or a Huey, and you could go out there for yourself and see what you could make of things, what was going on out there. Well, of course, nothing remotely like that happened in North Vietnam. They were a closed society. They were doing terrible things to their own people, many of whom starved years before the war even started. One of the things I think that went wrong in the West, an awful lot of kids, especially of my sort of age group, because I was in my 20s then, they believed that because the Americans were obviously the bad guys who were napalming all these villages, therefore the other side in Ho Chi Minh must be the good guys. I don't believe that at all. I think the other side were very bad guys who ran a loathsome society. But they won the media war because their policy of a closed society, where you only let in Jane Fonda to go and visit a few heroic villages, it worked for them. It worked very well. And I always remember, before I first went to Saigon, 1970, and I rang up a friend of mine who was a brilliant British journalist who'd done a lot of time in Vietnam. And I said, have you any advice? And he said, yeah. He said, always just remember, they lie, they lie, they lie. Now, he was right, but he meant the Americans. But where he missed an important point, which I think the whole Western media missed, is the other side lied too. We were seeing all the time, we were seeing the Americans doing many stupid things and many bad things. But we were denied access, and it worked brilliantly for the other side, that we were unable to see what they were doing. So I wish I could say the lesson is that the free media prevail. I'm afraid the free media did the West. Now I'm not one of those. I met many American officers who believed that the media lost them the Vietnam War. I don't believe that at all. They lost it all on their own. But I certainly believe that the Western media, by idealizing the North Vietnamese as freedom fighters, they were not freedom fighters. They were sort of tyranny fighters, in that the course which they were fighting, when you look at what they did to Vietnam after they won the victory in 1975, I mean, Vietnam has been a hellish society ever since, in which nobody's allowed to say what they think to this day.
Indeed. You discuss the almost disbelief of the riches that the North Vietnamese troops see when they enter Saigon at the end of the war, and the dismay of the South Vietnamese people as they realise what life is going to be like under a communist government. It seems almost as if the North Vietnamese, that if they'd understood the opulent lifestyle that was possible in South Vietnam, more of them would have deserted. And if the South Vietnamese understood what it had meant to live under a communist government, they would have fought harder. Why do you think there were such big differences between the populations and armed forces of the countries?
All of us can only judge everything by what we see before us. That my daughter once said to me, a very important phrase. She said, Daddy, life's what you're used to. And this is a profound statement. All the South Vietnamese troops could see around them was these corrupt, cruel officers and this shambolic army. They're being asked to fight year after year for a cause that appears to serve only a few hopelessly bent generals. They're not seeing what's happening on the other side. And I remember in a completely different context, I remember writing somewhere about the fall of Singapore in the spring of 1942. And of course, a very large British army with a lot of Australians in it who only just arrived, surrendered to a much smaller Japanese force. And I've been frequently criticized, but I'm afraid I think it's true. If those British troops had known what the Japanese were going to do to them in captivity, they would have fought a damn sight harder. they were fighting by civilized Western rules, and that they didn't realize the Japanese were playing by very different rules. Well, what is certainly true, I've met many, many South Vietnamese who've said to me, if we'd known what the North Viet, what Hanoi would do to our country after they won, we would have fought to the death. And I think there's some truth in that. But we have to remember also, by the way, although one said some cruel things about the North Vietnamese, they did run a very good army. Their army, they suffered terrible casualties and they kept going. Their troops suffered hardships, incredible hardships, and they kept fighting. And they were very good at what they did. And one has to give the North Vietnamese credit for, what they did with the Ho Chi Minh Trail and the sufferings that they endured, running supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail hundreds of miles in ghastly conditions, every kind of disease, whether it's malaria or beriberi or all the rest of it and so on. And they came out of all this, and they did believe they had a cause worth fighting for, whereas the South Vietnamese did not.
The Battle of Fire Support Base Marianne highlights the significant decrease in the quality of the US Army. What do you think were the factors that led to the decline?
You had three things. One, nobody wants to die for a losing cause. By the time of the Fire-Base Marianne battle, that everybody knew that America had effectively lost. And all through the early 70s, everybody knew that America had effectively lost the Vietnam War and was just going through the motions to try and keep going until there was some sort of peace settlement. So here you've got these guys sitting on this fire base in the middle of nowhere, and all they really want to do is they want to live. They don't want to die for a doomed cause. Then you've got the terrific racial tensions that I was looking the other day at a BBC film I made in 1971 with an American company in the boonies that we spent some days with. It's curious how ignorant you can be. I was 24 when I made that film. And I was looking at this film the other night, and I suddenly saw something on this film that I hadn't seen out there in the boonies. All the black guys there were clustered together in the company, and all the white guys were clustered together, and there was no interface between them at all. The racial issue in American units in Vietnam, the race war, which had, of course, started in America, the race war was of ferocious intensity in the United States, but this was translated into Vietnam. And thirdly, of course, this drug thing, which was also part of the late 60s, early 70s American culture. I have been flown by stoned helicopter pilots, and that is scary. But everybody was stoned by that stage of the game. I sometimes used to think I was, only because I was so frightened of becoming addicted, that I to this day never smoked a joint. But I think I was the only person in Vietnam who was not stoned. Not because I was Mr. Good Guys, I was just Mr. Frightened Guy at that point. But the drug thing was incredible. But what was amazing about the behavior of these guys, who were all stoned or drunk, when the North Vietnamese troops, sappers, stormed through the wire and shoot the hell out of this fire base. These American troops have got the idea in their head that they could opt out of the war unilaterally, that they could say, well, we don't think this war's worth fighting anymore, so we're just not going to do anything anymore. And it never crossed their pretty stupid minds that it takes two to tango, or not to tango. The fact that the North Vietnamese were still in the war, were not prepared to go along with any local truce. This is what cost a lot of them their lives. And of course, the leadership had more or less collapsed by then, because the leaders by then, if you really tried to lead and you tried to take your troops somewhere they didn't want to go, they were going to shoot you or throw a grenade, roll a grenade under your bunk one night. And this happened. There were hundreds I've written about in the book. I forget how many exact number of cases, but there were hundreds of cases of fraggings of unpopular officers. And this company we spent time with in the boonies, the BBC, the company commander told me absolutely explicitly, very nice guy, and I thought an excellent officer, he'd asked to be transferred to the Vietnamese Rangers because he could no longer stick working with American troops whom he couldn't control. And that's how bad things had got.
It's a scary thing for an officer to be thinking like that, or to be put into that situation. At what point do you think Vietnam was lost? Could the United States have ever avoided defeat or even won, or was the damage already done by the time that the French had left? If the US had had more people like John Paul Vann and David Hackworth, could the outcome have been different?
There were, and I've tried to pay tribute to them in my book, there were some very good American officers and civilians in Vietnam. They weren't all war criminals. They weren't all ghastly people who murdered babies. There were some outstanding officers and outstanding people. But America, I think the failure really derived from the fact, which I mentioned earlier, that the Americans were never really asking what's in the interests of Vietnam. They were asking what's in the interests of the United States. And they were preoccupied with trying to contain what they saw as the red threat, mostly Chinese, but also Russian. And their intelligence was so poor that even as late as 1972, that they were, Nixon and Kissinger in Washington still believed completely wrongly that if the Russians simply picked up the telephone from Moscow to Hanoi, they could stop the war at their will. And in fact, the Russians were as fed up with the whole thing as anybody. Brezhnev told the Soviet ambassador in in Washington, he said to him, "I do not wish to sink into the swamp of Vietnam." And he felt as stuck with having to support the communists in Vietnam as the Americans felt trying to support their side. But what is astounding is that as late as 1972, 1973, that the Americans could still have such a completely false intelligence picture of what was going on the other side. They still believed this was all part of some great communist conspiracy. But I think the war was unwinnable for the United States because the Americans were always prioritizing their interests over those of the Vietnamese people, and especially when they more or less authorized the assassination of President Diem back in 1963. That at that moment, when you allow the deliberate killing of your puppet leader, and everybody in Vietnam knows that you've allowed this to happen. All right, he was killed by Vietnamese generals, but the fact remains that everybody knows they wouldn't have dared move without Washington giving the nod. Well, of course, the supreme irony was that 6 weeks later, John F. Kennedy, who had at least tacitly authorized this, and he realized in a sort of way what a terrible thing he'd been party to. And of course, he himself was assassinated. But from that moment, a lot of Americans I interviewed said they realized, I mean, good Americans who had a lot of experience of Vietnam, they said from that moment, this whole thing was doomed. It was, I think, one of the first lessons. If you're going to make a success of any intervention, wherever it may be, whether it's in Timor, whether it's in Afghanistan or Iraq, you've got to convince the people on the ground that you're really behaving in their interests and not in your own.
Were the lessons from Vietnam forgotten in the more recent struggles in Iraq and Afghanistan?
Well, I was struck by the fact that an American Marine general who did 3 tours in Vietnam, and for whom I had the highest respect, named Walt Boomer. And I spent a couple of days talking to Walt Boomer, and I was enormously impressed with everything he had to say about Vietnam. I said to him at the end of 2 days talking to him, I said, well, how do you feel about it when you look back? And he said, and I won't attempt to mimic his accent, but he said, it bothers me that we didn't learn anything. He said, if we had, we wouldn't have invaded Iraq. It's quite extraordinary how people go on thinking, partly, and here's my parting shot on this whole thing, it's very easy for soldiers to fall in love with your own firepower. When you see everything that we've got and the other side haven't, all the helos, all the technology, and all the radio interception gear, and the drones, and the whole paraphernalia of modern Western war, and you think to yourself, how could we lose? But anybody who really studies a bit of history knows that actually, again and again, it's the people with the paraphernalia who have lost, and the people with almost nothing who've won.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Sir Max, for your time. So there you have it. I think Sir Max uniquely placed, based on his experience and his research and his real understanding of what occurred, both at a strategic level and how that impacted at the tactical level across the United States forces and from the public back in the United States, the Army of the Republic of South Vietnam, and the South Vietnamese people, and the North Vietnamese people, and the People's Army of Vietnam. A very complex system with many interdependent parts. And so if you're looking for a really good understanding of it, I would definitely recommend that you read Sir Max's book. It's quite a big text. The audiobook goes for 33 hours, but it is absolutely fascinating. 3 of his other books that I have learned an incredible amount from: The Korean War, Nemesis, which covers the downfall of the Japanese, and Bomber Command. And of course, you can't go past the Battle for the Falklands. So a big thank you to Sir Max for being so generous with his time. Not only an expert military historian, but also a true gentleman. Hopefully you have gained some further insights into the conduct of counter-revolutionary warfare.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.